We have one panel left. And we know we've got so many great folks in the room. There will be time. There's a happy hour starting immediately after this panel, so we hope folks can stay, hang out, compare notes, conspire about the future. Our next panel, and I welcome the folks up, is on policing and prisons. So we saved the easy stuff for last. I'm thrilled to welcome to the stage our moderator, Clarence Wardell at the U.S. Digital Service at the White House, who is an important leader in bringing digital solutions to challenges of open policing. Brittany Packnett, who is a leading voice in the Black Lives Matter movement and co-founder of Campaign Zero to bring a policy agenda to that mission. Lenore Anderson, who's the executive director and president of Californians for Safety and Justice, and also another colleague of mine at the White House, Roy Austin, who is the deputy assistant to the president for Urban Affairs, Justice, and Opportunity. So we're not slacking here for you on the closing session. We've talked about finding common ground areas, and criminal justice reform, policing, and prisons have seen among the most progress in some ways in terms of at least bipartisan agreement, and have also been the source of tremendous civic engagement and in some cases controversy. And so it is with great pleasure that I get to introduce this panel, and Clarence, please take it away.
Thank you, Dave. Where are we? Good afternoon now. If you all could let the folks who are in the lobby know that if they don't come back in here, they're ineligible for happy hour. So we're going to keep this pretty straightforward. We'll hopefully have a lot of time for conversation. We're going to talk technology, we're going to talk opportunity, open the floor up to talk a little bit more about some of the intersections here, particularly with these important issues. And I think as folks know, it's no secret that this police reform, criminal justice reform has been the president's, if it's not his top priority, 1B, right? The president has a lot of top priorities, but it's certainly one of the ones that he has spent a lot of time thinking and working on during his second term, in no small part to the likes in the works of folks like Brittany and folks who've been trying to keep the administration honest and having a dialogue around some ways we can move forward. And it is fitting today to have these three great folks on the panel because a lot of this work has happened at the intersection and will continue to happen at the intersection of data and technology moving forward. And so what I just kind of want to open it up here with a little bit is this theme of data and technology, and maybe Roy, if you could kick us off a little bit, and like Dave said, I've had the pleasure of working with Roy and his team for about the past 2 years, helping to launch the President's Police Data Initiative, Data-Driven Justice Initiative, which we'll talk a little bit about tomorrow. But the first time I met Roy, Megan Smith, US CTO, will be here tomorrow. She pulled me and Denise into Roy's office, never met before, and we sat down at his table, and this was fall 2014, post-Ferguson, and we kind of pitched this idea around, in a lot of ways, data, and Black Lives Matter movement brought this focus on the lack of officer-involved shooting data, right? But it was really this notion of what we don't have, quite frankly, is a lot of data around police-citizen interactions, whether you want to talk about shootings, use of force, traffic citations, day-to-day interactions. And so our pitch to Roy was, let's use the platform of the White House to try to convene law enforcement agencies and to get them to voluntarily share data. And I think Roy might have chuckled a little bit, but he didn't kick us out of his office, and he didn't think the idea was too absurd. So I'm just curious, Roy, if you could talk maybe a little bit around your thoughts around data and technology in this space from that time, how it's evolved since then, and where do you see it going forward, particularly around your work?
And let me be very clear, I should have kicked you out of my office because I think my life would have been a lot easier had I done so. Look, we talked earlier, and I heard a conversation about the thing about government and the federal government is that we have high quality data. And that's great in probably a lot of areas. but it's completely untrue in criminal justice. The criminal justice data, to use a really technical term, sucks. It is completely worthless. The stat that I like to point out is our hate crimes data. So our hate crimes data just came out. It was 2015 data that came out in November 2016. And the data, if you actually dig deeper, it shows that hate crimes, there are approximately 1,000 hate crimes in California. There were 1,000 hate crimes in California in 2015. There were about 500 in New York. There were 12 in Alabama. There were 0 in Mississippi. That is our, and I would note though that Mississippi actually has the best, has made the most of removing hate crimes, because in 2014 they had 1. So they've actually reduced by 100% their hate crimes. But all of our criminal justice data is unaudited. It is really just bad data. I heard someone talking about recidivism earlier today. The problem with even our recidivism data is we have 50 different definitions of recidivism, whether it's an arrest, whether it's another infraction, whether it's actually a conviction, whether it's a felony, whether we're talking about 3 years or we're talking about 5 years. And we're trying to use this data to make decisions, and we just need to stop doing it because our data is so bad, and it is racially discriminatory if you actually look a little bit deeper into it. Now, Clarence came into my office and said, well, let's talk about getting some officer use of force data, because Brittany and others were making all this noise about the fact that officers were out there hurting people. And I did kind of laugh, because I'm like, who would voluntarily put out data when you don't do it when you've been asked to do it for pretty much close to 50 years? And we started calling people. And one of the first people we called was the chief of Dallas, because he was already putting out this data. And he said, yes, I did this because I had a white officer shoot a black unarmed civilian. And before my city exploded, I said, let me put my data out there and show that I'm not hiding anything. And it helped to improve his community and police relations. And so we started calling more and more people said, you know what, we can do this. We can actually put this out there. And this is not data on crime, which I already said is really garbage data. It doesn't need to be, we really need to figure out another way to look at it. But this is on policing activity, on things like officer-involved shootings, complaints, citations, things that tell you what your police department is in fact doing. Now we have 130 jurisdictions covering close to 40 million people who have agreed to start putting their data up online, open. This is a big deal, because we have people doing it voluntarily, and what every one of them will tell you is, number one, it's saving them money, because they no longer have to go digging around, rooting for data every time they get a FOIA request. Number two, which was stunning to me, it's getting better data. One of the things that they put out there is officer or department diversity. A lot of them said before we had to put it out publicly, we thought we knew our diversity numbers, but when we had to actually check it before we gave it to the public, we found out that our numbers were wrong, and we actually have better data now. And number three, we are now creating a community that can start looking at this data, and we just had Austin, a group from John Jay come in, look at their data, all of their stop data, and determine that in fact there was disproportionate minority involvement in their stops and frisks. You have a progressive chief like Chief Acevedo in Austin, Texas, who is going to use that data now to make change. And so what you and Denise started is something that has grown to become a really amazing program that actually we just got an email today from Rochester, New York, saying they want to join this thing. Despite what happened in the election, they realize the importance of this to their community and police relations.
Thanks, Roy, and thank you. I don't want to take full credit for that. I kind of want to point down here to Brittany and maybe ask you a little bit to expand on this question a little bit. I mean, I will say in a lot of ways it was the work and the voice of people in the streets and in the communities who, and it was quite interesting, right, until kind of that inflection point, the really data conversation around policing was by and large crime data. And as Roy pointed out, we didn't really have good crime data, and it was a lot of those voices. And quite interesting enough, like when you talk, I don't talk to the president, but when you talk to people who talk to the president about these issues, this is one of the issues that really stuck with him and that he has actually been really engaged in, is around how do we get better data. And I'm just curious, Brittany, if you could talk a little bit about your work with Campaign Zero, President's Task Force, the role of data technology within the movement for Black Lives, particularly around storytelling and accountability, and just in some broader intersections there. And just maybe for the audience, if not everyone's familiar with Campaign Zero, maybe overview that a little bit.
Well, certainly thanks for having me. I have to apologize for my voice because my sinuses are not agreeing with this region, but I'm glad to be here. You know, as you alluded to, obviously technology has been of critical importance to the movement. Often we get asked the question, what is the difference between this current movement for racial and social justice and the mid-century civil rights movement? And the thing that most people want to point to is technology, right? But I often like to remind people that we use Twitter in the same way that Ida B. Wells used her pen. So Ida B. Wells was a woman who ensured that lynching was documented across the South and that the epidemic of lynching was something that was not ignored across America. And that's exactly what we do with hashtags. Right? That's exactly what we do when we get someone's name trending. That's exactly what we do when we say her name, to remind people that it's not just black and brown men being killed by police, but also women and people in the LGBTQ of color community. And so certainly it has been critical to our storytelling, but if the first leg of this battle was ensuring that people didn't ignore the problem and understood the scale of the problem, then I think we've certainly done that, right? You see a screen grab of Walter Scott being killed on the cover of Time magazine, right? You see people who were previously disengaged becoming engaged after the killings of Philando Castile in Minneapolis and Alton Sterling in Baton Rouge, which were both caught on film. And so certainly social media, new media, and cell phone technology have brought us to a point where people are having the conversation at a fever pitch. But then if the stage first was to create awareness, then the next stage has to be both about accountability and prevention, right? And I'll talk about both of those for a second. On this accountability piece, the challenge with data right now is that we actually believe that these numbers are still being underreported, right? And there have been tremendous strides by the White House, and we're very thankful for those things. But if the only tool that we have at our disposal is one that is voluntary, then we're still in trouble. Because we're still at a place right now where if your name doesn't trend and you don't make it into the Guardian's, the Counted database, and you don't make it into the Washington Post database, and you don't make it into our Mapping Police Violence database, then you just don't count, right? And that's really a problem. So we believe that the problem is still being underreported to this point. But we also recognize that we have to have a conversation about prevention. So Campaign Zero was co-founded by myself, Jeray McKesson, Janetta Elzy, and Sam Sinyangwe. We're all protesters from Ferguson, Baltimore, Charlotte, all around the country. And what we wanted to do was create a really user-friendly policy platform for people to leverage in their communities at the local, state, and federal level to say, here is what we are putting our bodies on the line for. Here are the changes that we want you to make. We have 10 policy points because we fully believe, and forgive the pun, that there is no silver bullet to fix this, right? That actually it is not just body cameras, which is what everyone wants to talk about, and they think that that is the technology panacea to fix this issue. Because if all it is a body camera to catch when you kill me, then we actually haven't solved the problem, right? So we want to make sure that we're having a broad conversation of everything from police training to data collection to protecting a citizen's right to film the police, because as those films started coming out, we saw state legislatures all across the country coming up with bills to prevent that right. And also police union contracts, right? And this issue of collective bargaining is something that people don't talk about often. And so we wanted to make sure that we collected all of these things and they were informed by the president's task force and the experts and the activists that we heard there, and that I heard as a member of that task force, by grassroots activists, by academic experts, by law enforcement themselves, model policy from around the country. And we came up with these 10 things because we realized that once we get the data, we actually can't be agnostic about it. What we do with the data matters. If all we're doing is collecting numbers, then we're not making a difference. And one of the things we discovered at Campaign Zero is that in order to actually prevent police killings and heavy use of force, we actually have to diminish the number of police interactions, right? Which means things like stop and frisk and broken windows policing are really problematic because they bring police into communities of color disproportionately, very aggressively, and you can count on a disproportionate number of young black and brown people having higher interactions with the police and therefore being more likely to be killed or injured by one. And so we know that we can't be agnostic about those kinds of things. So if you've got better crime data, right, how are you policing in such a way that it is actually culturally responsive, right, and not racial profiling? Again, we can't be agnostic about the data. We did a report at Campaign Zero on use of force policy. There are 8 use of force policies that we identified across the country that if you have any number of these, every single one of them dramatically reduces citizen complaints and killings by police, right? And so then we actually had to go through and FOIA request use of force policies from the 100 largest police departments across the country, because while we're voluntarily seeing a lot of this data being given, use of force policies and police union contracts are not at all public in most places, right? So we can't be agnostic about the data. We can't be agnostic about which data we collect and what we make transparent. We can't make this transparent and continue to hide that, right? Because if I know that I've got higher use of force numbers, then I actually need to be looking at my policies, and I need for my community to be able to look at my policies and have input on how we actually change these things. The last thing that I'll mention, because I brought it up, is around police union contracts. Now, in my full-time work, my other full-time work, I'm an educator. So I used to teach in Washington, D.C., and I was a member of the Washington Teachers Union, so I always start this off because I personally am a believer in labor. And yet, we have watched police unions across this country subvert due process to actually prevent justice for the community. And so what we found when we FOIA requested these police union contracts, and when we looked at states that have police Bill of Rights that are actually passed through the legislature, that you can have all of the data in the world, but when collective bargaining protects officers even when they've engaged in wrongdoing, that all the data in the world doesn't matter. So we look at the killing of Alton Sterling in Baton Rouge. We see that it was caught on film. We know what happened, right? And yet in Louisiana, officers have access to the evidence that's being mounted against them, and they have up to 30 days before they have to get interviewed, right, before they're interrogated. So I don't know about you, but in 30 days, I can come up with a whole lot of stories about what happened, especially if I have access to the evidence against me, right? So data is a piece of this, and yet we have to be very clear about how that data is used. And I think when I sit in rooms like this with people with a lot of access and power, it's really, really important that as you open up channels of opportunity and technology for folks, that you're not agnostic about how that stuff gets used, that you actually recommend to people what to do with that data. Because so often it's easy to say, well, I gave you the tool, what you do with it is your business, but that actually doesn't make us responsible citizens and responsible social actors. And so what I would ask you, as someone who took tear gas for this, who took pepper spray for this, who wiped tear gas out of young people and old people's eyes, who got ministers out of jail, right? That you actually take the access and the privilege and the power that you have to push what we know works and to actually make the kind of recommendations and hold people accountable, right? And say, if you're gonna access our tools and our technology, then here are the things we want you to do with it.
Thank you, Brittany. I have a lot of follow-up questions from that, but I'm gonna let it pass because we do want to open it up to the floor. So we'll open up in a minute. So folks, please start thinking of your questions. Lenore, just want to ask you a little bit, maybe to talk a little bit about your work with Californians for Safety and Justice Alliance, and really, I was just kind of doing the homework as a good moderator should do, and reading a lot about the amazing work that you all have done. And the thing that kind of stuck with me, right, a lot of your work focuses on this notion of pushing effective criminal justice strategies. Maybe you could talk a little bit about what that means to you in your day-to-day work and really this piece of effective. What does that mean in the context of criminal justice?
Sure. Well, it's great to be a part of this conversation this afternoon. The question around what's the role of data in criminal justice policy and criminal justice systems, I think that for me, in thinking about how we're going to improve our approach to safety and justice, there's 2 ways in which data has been very useful to us as advocates for reform. One is in developing our ability to separate myth from fact, and the other is in advancing the capacity of advocates and systems to direct engage, to have reason to direct engage with the communities that are both harmed by over-incarceration, but also harmed by crime and violence. And so those are the two ways in which we've used data to advance our criminal justice advocacy strategies, and I'll tell you a little bit about both. My organization, we run campaigns to change criminal justice policy, primarily focused on reducing over-incarceration. We have a lens to do that work that's focused not just on reducing the number of people who are incarcerated, but also replacing it with smart approaches to safety and actually reframing the whole conversation around safety so that we can advance something that truly lifts communities up. So in terms of separating myth from fact, one of the things that, I cracked up, I used to be an assistant district attorney and worked for a little while in county government, and the data sucks. It could not be more accurate in terms of how the criminal justice system works. I used to joke that, when we, track homicides, it's like you get out the book and you write it down, right? I mean, like, this is the .com capital of the world, and we don't even have this stuff in computer systems. So, this is, how data has been totally absent from the conversation around criminal justice. The state of California, we built 22 prisons and only 1 university in a 25-year time period. We increased incarceration rates by 5 times. We increased prison spending by 1,500%. In this state, in the forward-thinking state comparatively, and that's had a devastating impact, in particular on communities of color. African Americans are 7 times more likely to be incarcerated. Latinos are twice as likely to be incarcerated in California. And you would think with that, well, we must have, had a real good data reason to be doing that. We must have had some kind of information that was driving that. The realities are that the tough on crime era was driven primarily by anecdote and myth and racialized politics, essentially. And so we have had this dramatic expansion in a public system without any actual data driving that decision making about that expansion. And so separating myth from fact has been really important for us, trying to figure out, what has been the impact of that dramatic expansion in terms of safety. So when we launched Californians for Safety and Justice in 2012, we decided that we wanted to investigate, what are the myths that are driving over-incarceration, and how can we use data and do direct community engagement to try and challenge some of those myths and put forward a new path to safety. And so when we think about, some of the things that are sort of the underpinnings of mass incarceration, one of them is this myth that this is what crime victims want. That this protects crime victims, and this is what crime victims really want to see as a dramatic expansion in prisons and prison spending. So we decided, well, what's the data backing that? Let's figure it out. Let's actually direct engage with communities and talk to people who are survivors of crime and violence. And what we found was a couple of things. One is that the vast majority of people who survive crime and violence don't have very much engagement with the criminal justice system as it relates to their experience of being victims at all. Little known fact, 50% of crime goes unreported. Of the crime that goes unreported, very little, less than half of that is actually prosecuted. So we're really talking about a very small percentage of people who are lacking safety, who are not protected, engaging with this behemoth criminal justice system that we've built. So, one thing we learned is very few victims actually direct engage with the system as it relates to their experience being victims. The other thing that we learned is that the majority of crime survivors, especially survivors of violence, suffer long-term impacts as a result of trauma and unaddressed trauma, and the criminal justice system is doing little to nothing to intervene on that and help people get access to trauma recovery support or access to things that will help their chances from avoiding falling through the cracks later in life. So we have this real big chasm between who is experiencing a lack of safety and where the primary investments are as it relates to our criminal justice system. Another thing that we found was that, unlike some of the, anecdotes that drove the tough on crime era, those who are most likely to be victims of crime, especially repeat victims of crime, are young people of color. And those are our community members that are the least likely to access the very services that would help them recover from that experience of crime. And so that was a little bit about what we learned in terms of this gap between where a lack of safety exists and then where our criminal justice spending goes. So then we decided to ask, well, what do the majority of crime victims think about criminal justice policy? And what we found, again, was a real distinction between who's experiencing crime and violence and what they want to see in terms of criminal justice policy and what we have. The majority of crime victims think that prisons don't work. I anticipate if I asked all of you, you'd probably say the same thing, right? This is a pretty standard opinion at this point in American culture, is that, we kind of now know, and it's pretty much broadly understood, that prisons tend to make matters worse and don't really help in terms of stopping the cycle of crime. And when you ask victims what they want to see investments in, they'll tell you some of the things that are more data-driven, that happen at the community level, that are not being invested in appropriately to advance safety. Rehabilitation programs locally, community-based treatment programs, in particular attention to young people who are at risk of facing harm later. So all of that is a little bit about what we learned about the safety and how little we're doing to really advance safety. So we decided we're advocates. We like to change laws. We like to make our voices heard. And so we decided to organize a campaign. We joined with San Francisco District Attorney George Gascon. We ran the Yes on Proposition 47 campaign. And one of the things that was really key for us in developing this initiative, it was we're going to take a bunch of low-level crimes and reduce them from felony to misdemeanor so they don't waste prison space and we can save prisons money. But the second piece that was really important to us was reallocating that money and reallocating it into the very things that will help make communities more safe than our traditional approaches to criminal justice. So 10% of the money saved in prisons goes into trauma recovery centers for crime survivors, which was a direct request from the crime survivors we were engaging with in our work. I'll just say another couple of comments about in addition to separating myth from fact and uncovering the truth. The other way that data and technology has been a part of our work is trying to figure out what the barriers are. How can we direct engage with communities to understand the barriers that people coming out of the justice system face in trying to make it once you've served your time? And we found, California has 4,800 restrictions on people with felony convictions, post-conviction felony restrictions. 50% of these restrictions are unemployment. And so, and it's not just employment. You can't become a cosmetologist. You can't, join a lot of professional trade associations, prohibitions on housing, housing assistance, and the like. So one of the things that we've uncovered, Prop 47, when we changed these felonies to misdemeanors, there are 1 million Californians who are eligible for getting their record changed under Proposition 47. They have old, felony convictions from 20, 30 years ago. And so we've tried to figure out the data solution to that. There are challenges to that because most criminal justice systems can't tell you who has these old felony convictions in their records. So we haven't been able to really just kind of press that one button and notify 1 million people that they could potentially get their record changed. I wish we could. But because we couldn't do that, because we've had some data challenges trying to figure that out, we've gone county by county to reach out to people who may be eligible for getting a felony record removed. And we've tried to do as much direct community engagement as we can. We organized a fair in Los Angeles with attorneys, free attorneys on hand to help people fill out the petitions to get their records changed under Prop 47. Had no idea how many people would show up. My staff arrives at 6 o'clock in the morning and there's 20 people already in line at 6 a.m. The fair doesn't even open until 11 a.m. These are folks who got there at 4 o'clock in the morning and slept there to get a chance to meet with an attorney and get their record changed. And we were like, why did you come so early? This is 20, 30 years of living with the barriers that are created by a felony conviction. barriers that have been permanent, have intergenerational impacts. We had 5,000 people show up that day. And this is off of, billboards and radio ads. I mean, no real actual capacity to just direct reach people through data. And so since then, we've decided that we want to do as much as we possibly can to really address this issue of post-conviction felony restrictions on folks to be able to advance safety. So and I'm sorry, I'm talking too much already. I'll stop there.
Because no problem. But you did lead into actually the second thing, and I wanted to, and then we'll go to questions right after that. So it's this Technology and Opportunity Summit, and you really started to get into this piece, and Roy, as the head of the President's Office on Urban Affairs, Justice, and Opportunity, I almost want to set aside this technology piece for a second, and make it real explicit around what does the intersection of criminal justice reform, mass incarceration, what does that look like in terms of opportunity? I wrote a couple, and actually would have been really interested, and I hope, from Stanford's lab to see Raj's work overlaid with kind of mass incarceration rates and our criminal justice policy. I think that'd be really fascinating. I mean, just like two pieces here. 1 in 9 black children has a parent behind bars. 1 in 13 black adults can't vote because of a criminal record. And you alluded to a lot of these other restrictions on people who are leaving the system. Roy, you have maybe just a few thoughts around what does this work mean for opportunity and missed opportunity?
Yeah, so, I mean, if I had more time, I'd go through the 25 things that I think we have to do on criminal justice, but you probably won't let me do that, Dave, will you? Yeah, okay. But I mean, here, look, it starts, the reason why my office was created is because you cannot have criminal justice if you don't have labor, okay? If you don't have a jobs policy and that they have to be talking together. You can't have criminal justice if you don't have housing. So if people are homeless, if people don't have a place to go, you can't fix the criminal justice system. We have to start at the very beginning, and this is the work that Jim Shelton did with My Brother's Keeper, where we have the 6 milestones. Where you have to start at the cradle, college, career, and then keeping people out of trouble. You got to go through all of those things. And so when we talk about cradle, we talk about the fact that 4-year-olds are being kicked out, suspended, expelled from school. Majority of those black and brown kids. I suspect most of you acted up when you were 4 years old. If you were kicked out of school from that and you started that spiral, you too would end up in the criminal justice system. We have to start there. We have to move into all of school discipline. We have to look at school resource officers. We have to slide then into are people actually receiving an education at all, wherever they are going to school. We have to slide into, can they get a job? Do they have the skills? Do they have the skills to succeed? Do they have the skills to lift their family out of whatever their circumstances are? Can we do that? We have to look at the fact that if we're going to put people into jail, our jails, first of all, nothing in the criminal justice system is particularly evidence-based. Why do we lock someone up for 20 years for a drug transaction? Why? Because it makes us safer? No, because we end up with children of incarcerated parents, because we end up with collateral consequences. If we look nationally, it's 40,000. So none of this stuff actually is evidence-based, it's not data-driven, but we keep doing it. We just keep doing it over and over again, and the people who are impacted the most are boys and young men of color. But the thing is we have to be looking at all of these systems together, and then the other problem is none of these systems talk in the same language. So a juvenile in HHS might be up to 19, a juvenile in the criminal justice system, depending on what state you're in, sometimes it's 16, sometimes it's 17, sometimes it's 18, our systems cannot talk to each other. You have the National Crime Victims Survey, you have the Uniform Crime Report, okay? 2 things run by the Department of Justice that don't even use the same data. Right now, people are talking about there's an uptick in violent crime if you look at the UCR, but if you look at the crime victimization survey, exactly what Lenore was just talking about, people have not reported in that survey that there's been an increase in violent crime. So what data are we supposed to use? What data matters? And so we really, the starting point here on opportunity is, number one, we have to bring everybody to the same table. We have to have these discussions absent the silos, and we have to just get better data. And that's like the starting point for all of this stuff, is our data is so bad, this is straight up garbage in, garbage out, and we have a lot of garbage in right now.
But just to add to this, I know you didn't ask me, but, because see, let's call a spade, right? We're all in here thinking about what any of this is gonna look like for the next 4 years, right? So, because, a funny thing happened when the Department of Justice put out its Ferguson report. All of the headlines said that what the protesters in the community in Ferguson were saying was now proven true. Hold on a second. It should have been proven true the second that we told you it happened, right? Because people's lived experience is data. The fact of the matter is white middle-class dominant culture teaches us that only numbers matter, right? Not people's stories, not people's experiences, right? And so even though there were masses and masses of people coming forth and telling their stories after Michael Brown was killed about this tiny municipality alone, right? And then about St. Louis County more broadly, which is where I grew up and I still live, people didn't find it legitimate, right? And so it's one thing to collect the data, it's another thing to use your platform and your position to require that people believe it. Because if in a world where policy is racialized, right, in a world where kids that are kicked out at 4 and 5 years old, it's not just because of actual school policy, right, but it is because of actual implicit bias, right? In that world, people are going to look at the numbers on the paper and still say that that's not accurate or that it is due to some kind of inherent difference between people, right? Like, we have to reckon with the fact that that is a reality that we are now dealing with, right? The people really believe that. And so there has to be space in which, A, we make people really believe the data, and B, like I said, we demand that people do something with it by actually setting up those models. Because over the next 4 years, I'm trying to make sure that I'm following all the rules. Let me say this. I feel very fortunate and very blessed that I have sat next to the current president of the United States about 3 or 4 times to have this conversation. I don't think that will happen with me over the next 4 years. So people are wondering what to do, and we have to be like the force that pulls the culture in another direction, because we just go out there and make it happen. So if you read a book that lots of educators read called Why Did All the Black Kids Sit Together in the Cafeteria by Beverly Daniel Tatum, she's the former president of Spelman College in Atlanta. She talks about racial identity development, but she also talks about the moving walkway of racism. And she talks about 4 different people. She talks about folks that are on the moving walkway, and the walkway is going in the direction of racism or any kind of bigotry that you can name, and they are walking right along with that walkway, right? They may be conscious of it, they may not be conscious of it, but they are moving in that direction. And then there are folks that have at least realized that the direction that they're moving is maybe not right, so they've stopped walking, but they're just standing there and still moving in the same direction, right? Then she talks about a third group of people who at the very least have realized this is the wrong direction, and I don't exactly know how to go in the other direction, but I'm at least going to turn around. Then she talks about a fourth group of people who not only turn around, but run as hard and fast in the other direction as they possibly can. Not just by what they say, but by what they do. And if enough people turn around and run hard and fast in the other direction, you can actually change the direction of the walkway, right? And so I feel like when we take the data and when we take the tools and we take the opportunities that we create and actually set up the models, instead of asking somebody else to do it, we just do it ourselves, that can create that force to move things in the other direction. And that is what I think is the opportunity before us now, right? If I was raised to view every challenge as an opportunity, and if that's the opportunity before us now, we actually have the power to do that.
Thank you. So I know we have a little bit of time left. If there are questions in the audience, I don't see any questions. Okay. Oh, we got one back there. Okay.
Excuse me, short of federal intervention, what are mechanisms that can be used at states or cities to ensure that what you're asking for can actually happen?
You want to start?
I mean,
You mean as it relates to policing or
the whole thing.
the whole thing?
It's the people. I mean, it's
Yeah.
the community. It's a matter of people challenging their state and local government for change and actually caring enough and realizing that the system we have right now is a waste of money and a waste of lives. Yeah. And until people actually go up to their city council people, their school boards, their mayors, their police chiefs, Because this isn't stuff that happens on the federal level. It's great to have right now a president who cares about this at the federal level, but this is a state and local issue. And the only people who your mayors listen to are the people who are around them. And so we have to have the anecdotes, but we also have to have the data, and we have to have the business community saying, I can't hire anybody right now because everybody I'm looking at has a criminal record.
Yeah.
And so we have to form those coalitions to go and talk to our state and local government, in my mind, is what needs to happen.
I also think it's about how we invest, like I said, to create the models ourselves. So to extend this conversation about criminal justice, the activist community in Washington, D.C. protested a decision by the mayor to increase police presence in Southeast Washington, D.C., which is where I used to teach. Mostly African-American community over there. And what the crime data was showing was that crime was once again on the rise, and they attributed that to returning citizens, right? So people who had been formerly incarcerated and were returning home. We know that crime happens out of lack, right? So you've got an employment challenge, you can't find a job, and you need to put food on the table. Often you turn to crime, right? And so the activist community said, instead of taking all of this money and making us feel less safe by putting more police in our communities, why don't you do what has proven to work around the country and actually reinvest in the community in such a way that these people have a path to employment, right? They were unsuccessful in getting the mayor to make that reinvestment. Can businesses do that? Can philanthropists do that, right? All of these folks that want to teach our students to code, that's great. Can we teach returning citizens to code and then actually make sure they have a job doing it when they're done, right? Like, I just fully believe that demanding, power is never given, right? It always has to be demanded. And so what Roy said is absolutely right. And simultaneously creating the models, right, that can show people what's possible and making the investments in people and in our communities that folks in this room have the power to make, I think is also critical.
And I would just say, I worked in local government for years before doing the work I do now, and I think, there is no greater responsibility that I think especially local government leaders feel than the execution of public safety. It's an incredible amount of attention and time from residents on this issue that mayors face, city councils, boards of supervisors. And the question I think that we need to ask ourselves is, are we having the right conversation around safety? What are the metrics that we're looking at when it comes to safety? What are alternative metrics that we could put forward that would be more valuable in creating long-term and sustainable safety, especially for the communities hardest hit by crime and violence? Typically the conversation around safety revolves around conviction rates, it revolves around arrest rates, it revolves around length of sentence, how long of a sentence can you get as a former assistant district attorney? I know that that's a conversation that happens a lot. And the realities are, those are not the metrics that are going to define the safety experience at the community level. How much access to health and well-being, how much access to stability, how much access to economic opportunities do communities have? Those are the metrics that should really become the centerpiece of our conversation around safety. And until we can switch the conversation around safety to be one that's really about community health and well-being, we're going to keep on having these inappropriate and inadequate metrics drive our investments and our resources. And this is not just a problem in terms of misplaced resources. It actually, the over expenditure on prisons and incarceration has blinded us to the very issues of lack of safety that too many community members face. We do little to nothing. Before I was an assistant district attorney, I worked with incarcerated youth, and one of the things that happened in that time over and over again, every time I interacted or engaged with incarcerated youth, it was almost always the same story. The fact of their incarceration was not actually the worst experience of their life. All of them had been victims of crime years before, and little to nothing was done. There was every system that touched that child did nothing. And we have a bunch of resources over here, but we don't think of how those things link when it comes to expressing what we want our priorities to be as it relates to safety.
So we only have like a minute left. Okay. So we're going to close out just really quickly, quick responses. I want folks to choose fear or hope. What looking out over the next 4 years around this particular area, what is either your biggest concern or where do you derive your greatest source of hope? Or
My biggest concern is just that, this law and order talk is bunk, but is going to carry the day because it's quick and easy. My hope is that right now we have a bipartisan coalition where we have Senators Mike Lee, Senator John Cornyn, who have seen criminal justice reform work and standing and sitting beside Cory Booker and Pat Leahy and Dick Durbin, and that hopefully that they all stick to what they know is the right answer and push that through and don't go back to the stop and frisk policies of the past.
Lenore?
I mean, hope. There's no other way to be, really. Plus, we have Brittany, so I feel like we're good. I mean, the road is definitely windy, but I think that the majority of criminal justice policy happens at the state and local level. Regardless of the election of Trump, I don't think that was a repudiation of criminal justice reform, the direction we've been going for the last 10 years. I think there's still tremendous, tremendous bipartisan support for it, and I think that we can continue to make a pathway forward.
I'd say that my fear is that the kinds of things that you all are discussing at the summit that we're talking about, anything with the word justice in it, social justice, criminal justice, the school to prison pipeline, are going to be demeaned as nothing more than identity politics and deemed unimportant, instead of recognizing that issues of liberation and equity are not at all partisan issues, that they're human issues and American issues, right? And that it's central to our ability to be the country that we say we aspire to be. And so, therefore, though, my hope is that we will see a real rise in the spirit of folks who understand that, and the willingness to stand firm on those values, irrespective of what the cost is, and to innovate and lead and challenge and push and create institutions and evolve institutions and create leaders and evolve leaders who act in that way and who refuse to let the all-important work that we're talking about be pushed to the sidelines.
All right, well, thanks to the panel. Let's continue the conversation.